Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss back here, and here's the a continuation of our evolution unit where we're going to focus a little bit on natural selection. So let's head over to the uh, slideshow presentation here. Whoop, that's not it. Let's see if we got this somewhere here. Where is that? There we are. I just want to make sure that that's looking correct. And yes, it is. All right. So where we had kind of left off before we had gotten to the natural selection portion of the evolution unit is some thoughts about, here, I'll back up just a little bit. Yeah, we did it last time we did a natural selection simulation. So leading up to this, we had gotten that the Earth is really, really old. And we have a number of different metrics that all confirm or corroborate each other so that scientists have a really a lot of confidence in each of these measures and that the Earth is quite old. Then we, like Darwin and others, showed that all the different breeds of dogs that we have today came about in the last 30,000 years, and probably actually much earlier, much shorter time frame than that. But 30,000 years ago, there were no breeds of dogs. There was just one species of wolf. And through domestication and selective breeding for traits, humans were able to um, uh, the uh, sort of diversity that's grown from dogs. And it's not just in dogs. We've done it in plants and other domesticated animals. And that's to show that traits can dramatically change. And really, we're changing the genetics and then seeing this change in traits occur in a really short period of time. So we could imagine then that if we were given a really long period of time, that traits could really change, and we might see things as wildly different as a bear and a fish if given enough time. But the question is can this sort of selection, this sort of breeding that humans have done, which selects for certain traits and allows offspring with a certain trait to reproduce. That's essentially what you're doing with breeding. You're allowing certain pups to grow up and match with others that have traits that you desire and allow them to breed so they produce more pups, whereas those that have the traits you don't like are not bred. They don't create new pups. So the question is does this selection to allow for offspring that have desirable traits, does that happen in nature? And what does that look like? So last time we did a few simulations, we talked about the peppered moth and how environmental conditions can change the genetic distribution which then makes the phenotypes different. So the question, so this time we're going to offer a couple more examples of how natural selection, we have seen it happen in nature, that nature is selecting for certain traits. And I'm saying nature in quotes because these two that we're going to look at today are a little bit contrived, but they will show the same point. So one example of this, of sort of natural, I call this unnatural selection, is this focusing on elephants. So most African elephants have tusks. However, by random chance, about 6% are homozygous recessive. A small amount are TT, small t, and they have small tusks or no tusks at all. So we're kind of given this distribution where large tusks are big T, medium tusks are the heterozygous version, and then homozygous recessive, the small t, have almost no tusks. And for a variety of reasons that we'll see in the video that we watched in class, having tusks is always an advantage for these elephants. It helps them strip bark from trees. It's involved in sort of combat with males for sort of dominance. And this tusks were always an advantage until a civil war erupted in Mozambique, and elephants were killed for their tusks. So during the Civil War, both sides poached these elephants so that they could get their ivory tusks and sell it for resources and weapons to fight this civil war. Oops, I gotta make sure that that doesn't go. So prior to this, and there are some graphs that we'll have seen in the video, prior to this poaching, there were around 2,000 elephants total in Mozambique in 1976. And roughly the distribution of genotypes, the kind of predicted genotypes, was about 70% had large tusks. That 70% of 2,000 is 1,400. About 24% were heterozygous, so medium-sized tusks. So that 24% of 2,000 is 480. And only about 6%, 120 elephants, had no tusks or very small tusks. And like we said, so unfortunately, during this short civil war, about 16-year period, 90% of all of the elephants, 90% of the total elephants were killed during this period. And like we said before, elephants were killed for ivory to sell and buy weapons. So now what we want to look at is how did this environmental impact, how did it affect the distribution of elephants immediately after the Civil War? And what would be that lasting impact on this species after? So let's move over to, we're going to move over to my iPad, and we're going to work on that lecture guide document. So I'm going to share my iPad screen here. And we're going to take a look at seeing how the Civil War in Mozambique would affect the genotype distribution of elephants. So like we said, here we're seeing that 90% of the 2,000 elephants were killed. That left only about 180 elephants total. And there's no exact right answer to this, but I'm asking us to kind of think about what the distribution might now be. And if you remember from the lecture, about 120 elephants had very small or no tusks at all. So my bet is that those animals would not have been killed. They don't have any ivory. So maybe a few of the ones with small tusks, maybe at the very end, were poached just to get a little bit of ivory. But I would say of the 120 that started, my prediction is that most of them would have survived. And probably the remainder, let's say maybe about, there's 120. Yep. So then maybe the remainder, many of those were medium-sized tusks, and then maybe a small amount. And you could think maybe this isn't even, maybe you want to be a little simpler. And let's say all of the elephants with small or no tusks were saved. And then maybe there's 50 or so with medium, and then almost all of those with large tusks were killed. So there's very few with large tusks that survived this Civil War because they were so valuable to the soldiers that were fighting. So now the Civil War stops. The government gets the poaching under control, and the elephants are protected, and their population is allowed to grow, to rebound. And so that was in about 10 to 20 years later, about 20 years later, the elephant population has rebounded to from 180 to 1,000 elephants. So now we're trying to guess what might be the genotypes of these new 1,000 elephants. And what I'm asking us to think about is, remember, these genotypes here will be the parents, right? They're the ones who are going to grow up, become mature, and mate and produce the new offspring. And if most of those offspring, so let's get the elephants here. So this is about 18 elephants here. This is 50%, or sorry. Oh, no, sorry. I screwed this up real quick. I see what I did here. I would say that this is about 10, 120, and 50 here. So what percent of the genotype? 120 out of, so maybe we could do this, sorry, maybe we can do this the other way, is let's say that about 80% are this, 15% are medium, and only 5% are large tusks. So that makes the math a little bit easier, because this is 5% of 180 is 9 elephants. So this is 27, and that's 36. So this is about 144 elephants. Sorry, I had my percents and the numbers a little backwards there. So now remember, it's these elephants here that are going to be mating and producing the next offspring. And maybe there's a slight advantage now without poaching for having larger tusks, but it's probably not interacting so quick. So what's happening is probably the percentages are going to stay about the same. 80%, 15%, and 5% for now. So now this is 50, 150, 150, and 800 elephants. So before the Civil War, most of the elephants were big T, and only a small amount had small tusks. But when the when the selective pressures from this Civil War favored elephants with smaller tusks, what happened is it totally shifted the population so that elephants now had smaller tusks. And while this was caused by humans, and I call it unnatural selection, you might imagine that the same processes could exist where environmental conditions change, animal predators adapt, and new features in a species become advantageous. And over time, if those new features keep accumulating, you could imagine that the different animals start looking more and more different from each other, that the species changes. So another example of this was shown in guppies. This is an experiment that was done in a laboratory to test the fact of the pressures that might lead to physical changes, physical traits that change in a population. Remember, not an individual doesn't change, right? But over time, slight changes in the population happen. So one thing you might know, like in guppies, like some birds, the more colorful, ornate of the animals are usually the males. They're trying, like peacocks, they're trying to attract the females. So in this case, the males are the most colorful and kind of ornate of the guppies here. What functions might the spot serve in the wild? So one thing you might think about is that these spots, these colorfulness attract mates. You want to get seen, right? And the more colorful maybe, and the more like kind of, it probably takes energy to sort of produce this color, like in peacocks, to produce these feathers and to produce the proteins that make these colors in guppies might also signal a sense of health, right? So if females are going to invest in carrying the offspring from these males, they want to have the most genetically healthy, right? They want their genes to carry on, so they would prefer to mate with a healthy male. So they signal mates, and maybe it's a sign of health. Sign of health. Okay. What might be advantages and disadvantages? So these advantages are kind of like the more colorful you are, more mating opportunities. However, you might imagine what could be a disadvantage of this in most natural environments. So think back to the ecology unit, or think back to our wolves and rabbit simulation. What might be a disadvantage of being so colorful as a male, or the more colorful males? Right. You might attract predators. You could attract predators. You don't really often want the predators to see you. So one thing that we're going to get at here, and we just don't have a ton of time to dive into this in class, but I mentioned it a couple of times, is there's this competition in many animals for attracting mates to create offspring and hiding from predators. So if there's low chance of getting a predator, right? Like let's say the predator population is pretty low, there's a low chance of getting eaten by a predator, then your color is probably going to be much higher. It's more advantage to attract a mate. However, if there's a chance of getting eaten by a predator before you reach reproductive age, if that's very high, then it probably favors those males that have much lower color, right? They're going to survive, and they're going to be the only ones around to attract a mate. So there's kind of this balance between how much predation and how much attracting mates. So let's continue on and think a little bit more about, let's do the setup for this guppy experiment. Okay, so we kind of talked through what possibly would be happening during the Civil War and how that would affect the elephant population. And then we're going to, in class, where you talked about this idea of speciation and natural selection, and I sort of just talked about it, is that species get divided or environmental conditions change and species adapt the traits that certain animals have might be more advantageous in a certain environment versus the old environment. And now those animals that have those traits, right, will have a chance to produce more offspring and will pass those traits on. And then there'll be even more traits that are more advantageous. And there's just this balance of resources. Okay, so we'll watch that quickly in class. Okay, so here was this experiment that was really creative experiment that was set up. It's speciation and natural selection is tested in the laboratory using guppies. So the questions that were tested are, do population genetics change in response to predators in the environment? And first, what we're going to look at is, do the population genetics change in response to finding mates? So remember, we're not measuring the change of individuals, but rather selecting for certain traits in the population that get passed on. So a particular fish has the number of spots it's going to have. It's not changing, but what determines the number of spots it has or how colorful it is its genetics. Does it have a big G or a little g? Those determine its traits. And if it survives, it's going to pass those traits on to its offspring. It's going to pass those genes on. And over time, we change the genetic population. All right, so we talked about which ones are the males and which ones are the females. And we're going to focus. So these are more looking like the males that were in this experiment. And so they're either more plain looking or have more spots or different size spots. And we talked about how these spots might be an advantage or a disadvantage. The advantage being they signal to females that I'm a male and I'm healthy, and we should create offspring together. The disadvantage is, hey, I'm a fish here, predator. I'm one of the fish that you like to eat. So you have to have this balance. Okay, so here's how this creative experiment was set up. Basically, what these researchers did is put guppies that have a range of different spots and spot sizes in two different backgrounds. So one background has these black pebbles, and this doesn't do a great job of showing it, but A here in this background matches very closely. It kind of blends into the background, whereas B, a guppy with not many spots or very small spots sort of sticks out against this background. It's a little hard to see here, but in the second condition, it's a little easier to see. Whereas A here, these male guppies that have small and not many spots really blend into this sort of sand background, whereas the guppies with bigger spots and more spots stick out against this sand background. So that's the setup. And what these experimenters did is they now added female guppies in here, and they let the experiment go with male and female guppies for 15 generations. And there's no predators here. So it's kind of like a very good aquarium where you haven't added any predatory fish. So it's just guppies, male and female, and they wanted to see what would happen. The one condition is the gravel background where the spotted males, the more heavily spotted males, blend in, or the sand background where the more lightly spotted males blend in. And remember, in this first condition, there are no predators. So they let it go for 15 generations. I mean, I can't even tell you, that's like your great grandparents. So that's basically like following your 15 generations is, let's say it's 25 years per generation. That's like following your family back like 400 years, right? So this has gone on for quite a while. So let's see what happens. So as you might have expected, based on what we said before, in the gravelish background, the population of guppies changed such that there were many more of the males had very few and small spots. They stuck out against the background a lot more. And in the other condition, the exact opposite happened. The population shifted in such a way that more of the guppies had more and darker spots. They stood out against the sand background. And this was really creative because set up those two conditions shows that it's not something about the guppies and their spots that attract the males independently. It's how these animals are interacting with their environment, right? The environment can guide what traits are favored. And I thought that was a really creative use of this experiment. So what did we discover? This is question 15 in the document. What did we discover from this experiment one? Is that the population can change to favor the traits that lead to increased reproduction, to create more offspring. So what's favored in sort of evolution is the ability to produce more offspring. So let's use the sand background as an example. If you stuck out, if you had the trait of more spots and darker spots, initially you were more easily recognizable by the female guppies, and you created more offspring. And now those offspring, because of your genes, were likely to have more and darker spots. And you could imagine that there might be even a variation within that. Let's say there's 10 genes or so that control the spots. Those now that had more and darker spots would be at even another advantage. And so you keep increasing the advantage for more and darker spots to be recognized by females. Okay. So this is another one, the initial setup, coarse gravel, no predator. You can see that these darker and more spots are really blending in, and the fewer and less spots are kind of sticking out. And after 15 generations with the coarse background, we saw the lighter guppies with fewer spots kind of taking over in the population. And the exact opposite happened with a sandier background, where the darker spotted guppies stood out against the sandier background. I don't love this look at it. But after 15 generations, they sort of took over. So you were able to start, and I think an important point is you start with the same exact beginning of the distribution of spots in the guppies. You have one aquarium and you just split it in half, and you can see these changes happening. So what we learned is that selection for mates in nature can drive changes in species. It can drive genetic changes that are seen as these physical traits. Okay, so now what would happen with the same experiment with guppies if we changed it a bit and added something, a predator? So we add a predator, and the one that they add is this pike cichlid. And a pike cichlid is a predator that eats guppies. And so now we're trying to predict, how might the results change? If females can spot the males, who might also be able to spot the males? And so here we have our pike cichlid. And what is the prediction here? Which genetic trait will be selected? Will it be the same as no predator condition or different? Remember again that these individual fish aren't changing, but over time, the population will change because certain traits will be favored. So make some predictions of what you think is going to happen when we have this sandy background, but there's a predator there. What types of fish, what spotting pattern do you think is going to be most favored? And so here are the results. So what we see is after 15 generations, the same setup as before, that instead of previously when there was no predator, the males that stuck out, the more spots and darker spots, was favored in this condition. And we predicted that was because it was easier to find mates. However, when you add a predator, the exact opposite happens. Those guppies with fewer spots and more blending into the background were more likely probably to evade predation, and were then lived to be able to pass on their offspring. So what I ask here is some other questions. So it's probably based on this that we can guess that this pike cichlid hunts by sight. But you could imagine if it hunted by smell, if it hunted at night and by smell, that different traits in these fish might be produced. Or you might imagine, what if this not by sight, but what if it could feel the waves that the fish were producing when they swam, right? Might that not be an advantage to be more sleek and aerodynamic? So all of this is happening in nature. And this is one example just to show that an introduction of a new predator can have very quick changes in the types of traits that are shown by these animals. So let's quickly, as we go, let's jump back over now to our lecture guide and see if we can complete this story a little bit here, so that maybe it reinforces that concept a little bit more. All right, so here we are. What did we discover from Guppy experiment number 1? That without predation, getting recognized, this is a bad way of saying it, maybe you have a better way of saying it, getting recognized by mates is an advantage, and that trait is continually passed on to future generations. Okay. Which genetic trait do you predict will be selected for in Guppy experiment number 2? Well, I think what I would have predicted is that I chose blending in. Blending in with bottom. And I should say, this is low spots. And because I predicted this, because if I thought that this, the pike here, if it saw the males before they reached reproductive age and ate them, then the males that had those genes would never be able to pass them on to their offspring. So only those that could evade predation, not get eaten, would reach maturity to be able to mate and pass on their offspring. And so, yeah, this made sense to me. Yes, I was correct there. So if you believe that random genetic change cannot lead to an advantage, so let's say you're opposed to this theory of this theory, and when we say theory, remember all the scientific evidence that's coming together, and you said this random genetic change cannot lead to an advantage, what would you need to study to prove to convince yourself? So I don't really know, right? Or maybe you believe, like maybe you want to contribute to this understanding, a more refined understanding of how animals evolve and generate new species on our planet. Maybe you can think of a creative experiment for this. I right now don't know exactly the experiment that I would do, but I think scientifically we're in need of additional experiments to help us understand this generation of new species. And I should say that this idea of speciation is that there's constant climate change in our world, or animals of the same species can be split due to changes in geography, a river growing wider over time, or an animal getting swept away in a storm to a far off island. So what started as the same species now has been split, has been divided, so they can no longer intermix. And when that happens, generation after generation, these animals that used to be of the same species are being influenced by their own unique environments and are constantly passing on the traits that are at the most advantage to that environment. And if those environments differ at all, over time, these animals will be selected for different traits. And after some period of time, they will no longer be recognized as the same species. And usually what that means is that they can no longer be bred together to provide reproductively competent offspring. They can sometimes mate and produce an offspring, but that offspring can't produce offspring itself. So they've divided so much that they can't now reproduce together. And that's generally what we say about a different species. So that would be one place to start. And there are some really great experiments of this, of lizards in the mountains in California being split by the formation of those mountains, and seeing two different lizard species on either side of those mountains. So that would be one place that you could start. And I think it's worthwhile thinking of, somebody thought of this experiment to kind of test this idea of natural selection and gave us sort of a blueprint to be able to extend our understanding of this. And maybe you think of, maybe you start now thinking of an experiment, and sometime when you become a scientist, you can actually conduct that experiment and add to our understanding of how species have evolved on this planet. So I'm going to head back to our slideshow and just finish up there. So what we've seen now up to this point is we've seen 4 examples of natural selection and speciation. These are the processes that Darwin and others suggested would drive evolution. They have been tested in real life and in the lab. All the experiments provide new details, and they all confirm the original mechanism that Darwin proposed, that different traits are selected for in different environmental conditions, and over time, many years, that can lead to changes in species. This is why nearly all, greater than 99% of scientists, believe that biology is shaped by descent with modification and natural selection, i.e., the process of evolution. So what do we know so far? The Earth is really, really old. Humans have dramatically changed animals and plants in a relatively short period of time by artificial selection. The same selective pressures exist in nature and can change animals in predictable ways. And we have seen natural selection change the genetic makeup of animal populations in our lifetimes. So now the question is, animals can change. We can set up conditions to see them change in nature. The Earth is really, really old, so we can imagine that massive changes in animals could happen over long periods of time. And so now the question is, have species actually dramatically changed throughout the history of Earth? Has this actually happened? And lucky for us as people who want to understand the origins of life on our planet, or how life got to be the way it is, there's a thing called the fossil record. There's fossils, and we'll get to see if animals actually have dramatically changed throughout time. And that will be our lesson for next time. Thanks a lot, and I'll